I'm Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government, slip of the tongue there. It's my pleasure to introduce in our lecture series Harley Balzer, who is an associate professor of history at my alma mater, but also where I taught before I came to the Bush School, Georgetown University. He's a professor in the Government and International Affairs in the Department of History. From 1987 to 2001, he served as the director of the University's Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies. He has a very distinguished career, both as a practitioner and as an academic. At Georgetown, they celebrate doing both. That's not always the case at universities across the country. I'm not going to go through all of the things he's done in his career, but most of them have been related in some way to Russia or formerly to the Soviet Union. But he is an expert on the role of science and the Russian economy. He's doing 3 book projects now. One is on a comparison of the Russian and Chinese way or journey in integrating into the global economy. The second is one focusing on the current Russian political situation. And the third deals with financing of higher education in the Russian Empire, the USSR, and now in Russia, comparing the 3 models. So he's doing some fascinating work, and he's going to talk to us this evening about civil society, public opinion, and he uses the I word, which I think has not been used by the administration yet, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is what it is. Harley, please.
It is definitely an invasion, and I think President Obama pretty much said that to Putin. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming at what for somebody might be dinner time. And I guess another way of titling this would simply be say, I want to talk about Russian society, how it's developed, and what this invasion of Ukraine might mean for Russian society. Because if there's a solution to what Putin is doing in Ukraine, I think it's going to come from Russian society, either the elite, the people, or both. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the history of civil society in Russia. That to some people sounds like a really short lecture because there isn't much, but actually there's more than most people think. Talk about what the Soviet period did to that civil society, again very briefly. Talk about the 1990s, a period that's not getting enough attention for the positive things that happened. And then go through what Putin has done and what this invasion of Ukraine might mean for Russian civil society. Basically 3 assaults, one early in his first term as president, one in the middle of his second term, and one since he came back into office. The history of Russian civil society, I guess I could go on for an hour, but the really important thing to say is that contrary to a lot of received wisdom from historians with whom I disagree, there was civil society. There are a couple of excellent books on this. Russians joined voluntary associations every bit as much as Germans did in the second half of the 19th century. Russian professional organizations were quite active. In the 1905 revolution, the Union of Unions, the middle class organization pushing for political reform in Russia, was really a bunch of professional and voluntary organizations that had a major impact on Russian politics and actually forced the Tsar to sign concessions politically and make some major constitutional changes, which unfortunately got reversed. Civic life was vibrant after 1905, up to the revolution. During the war, civil society groups played a major role helping the Russian military, really making up for a lot of the incompetence in the Tsarist administration. After 1917, things were a little different. But even after the revolution, after the Bolsheviks came to power in the Soviet Union, it took more than a decade before Stalin really cracked down on civil society. When I got into some Soviet period archives for the first time early in Gorbachev's perestroika, I was surprised to find out that voluntary associations like the Russian Technical Society were still functioning in 1927-28 and had grandiose plans that got very derailed. But Stalin did pretty much squelch civil society in the country. And two major elements to what he did. One was monopoly, and the other was mobilization. That is, no groups other than government-controlled groups, and a lot of what we call gongos, government-organized, non-governmental organizations. That is, if you were in almost any profession, you had to join a union that was government-sponsored, clubs, any kind of civic activity was likely to be organized by the Communist Party. And this began to change a little bit after Stalin died, but not enough. There were some groups that did try to organize somewhat independently from the party, especially environmental groups. But for a lot of Russians, being forced to join the government's organizations really gave organizations themselves a bad name. And people, even to this day in Russia, are skeptical of what we call civil society groups because of the governments having been so intrusively involved, forcing people to join their groups. That's what totalitarianism is all about. So it had a lasting impact. They've got a lot of experience with independent organization. People distrust organized groups. And another thing about Russian society that's crucial is the low level of interpersonal trust. The World Values Survey dealing with Russia for 20 years has shown Russia at the bottom, almost worldwide, of people trusting each other. And that's a direct legacy to what the Communist Party and the KGB did to the society. And it inhibits the healthy development of civil society in Russia today. Once the Soviet Union began to try to reform itself, in the Gorbachev era during Perestroika, there were a lot of informal civil society groups organized, a lot of environmental groups, continuation of something from the Soviet period, and those environmental groups in the non-Russian republics in particular morphed into the national fronts that became the drivers of the demand for first sovereignty and then independence. In the Baltics, it was the environmentalists who were at the core. In Central Asia, several countries as well, Kyrgyzstan in particular. And that's a part of the history that's unfortunately getting lost. There was a lot of horizontal communication in the Gorbachev era that was fascinating. When the Baltic countries were in the lead in organizing protests and trying to foster some way of getting more sovereignty, or else finally breaking up the Soviet Union. When the Uzbeks finally got around to creating a popular front, they got the documents from Estonia and translated them into their native language, Uzbek, bypassing Moscow as a way to have the protocols that you need to organize one of these movements. So there was a lot going on in this period that laid the basis for organization that even to this day has some echoes in the country. The negative side of it was there were also efforts by the KGB, secret police, to sow distrust. They put spies, infiltrators in a lot of these organizations, and that has had some very serious negative repercussions. Again, that low interpersonal trust is really amplified by that historical experience. There was also a lot of popular mobilization during the Gorbachev era and into the early 90s, both in the regions and in the capitals. And in 1991, there was really nationwide resistance to the coup, the attempt to restore some form of Soviet power in the country, August 1991. And characteristically, once that was over, But we always see in these popular protest movements, they get very rapid mobilization and very rapid demobilization. It fades pretty quickly. So this is Manege Square in Moscow in March 91. This is Leningrad in August 1991. Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad. You know, people who say that the protest was only in the capitals are wrong. And you know, the putsch was defeated. Gorbachev came back totally weakened. He destroyed himself the day he got back to Moscow. And in the 1990s, there are these, as usual in Russia, contradictory trends. As usual anywhere, but especially in Russia. The contradictions always seem to be sharper. There's a lot of freedom, some continuation of the perestroika reforms. Human rights groups like Memorial were extremely active in the 1990s. The environmental movement got a lot of foreign funding and support and assistance. A lot of my students went and worked with groups like this in the 1990s in Russia. During the war in Chechnya, the first war in Chechnya, mid-90s, when the army totally botched what to do with injured and dead soldiers, soldiers' mothers, an old Russian tradition, reasserted itself. They became a very effective non-governmental organization. They still are. We'll come back to them. So there was a lot of activity. The negatives are that most of the funding was foreign. There wasn't much money in Russia in the 1990s. Oil prices were low. And foreign funding inevitably skewed these organizations' priorities. You know, if you're being funded by the foreigners, you're going to try to do what they want so you get more money. The foreign organizations always wanted to fund new groups. They would fund somebody for 2 or 3 years and assume they should then be on their own feet, which was a silly idea, but you can't argue with foundation officers too much. They're all powerful. And so what would happen is that the same 6 or 8 people would shift who was in charge and who was writing the application and write a new grant with a new name to the same funder with the same people, which didn't achieve what they wanted, didn't make the group more effective, didn't make it larger. It was not our finest moment in terms of helping a country deal with its problems. There was a continued lack of trust between people that inhibited the work of these groups. And Yeltsin's regime is contradictory also. It's perfectly willing to accept non-governmental organizations, didn't do much to encourage or fund them. And that was a problem. In retrospect, they might have been better off then than they have been since. They had a lot of freedom. Nobody was trying to destroy them. On the other hand, they weren't getting much support, and except from the foreigners. So civil society in Russia through the 1990s is relatively weak, and Putin takes advantage of that. When Putin comes to power, becomes prime minister in August of 1999, Yeltsin resigned on New Year's Eve, right before the new millennium. Putin as prime minister became acting president. 3 months later, he won the election to be president. And even when he was prime minister, he had a kind of interesting meeting. Not kind of, a very interesting meeting. He got together the representatives of civil society on one side of a room in the Kremlin, and the business community, the economic interests, the academic community. On the other side, he had the military and the FSB, the successor to the KGB. And for 3 hours, he listened to them argue about whether Russia should do what China had done and build a great firewall to control the internet, to limit access of information. And the civil society, academic, economic groups said, you'll do that, you will kill our international connectivity, you'll kill our relationships with colleagues, you'll undermine our economy, our ability to work with other countries. Security people said what you'd expect, we need to get rid of these foreign influences. And at the end of the 3 hours, Putin said, comrades, and he used the word comrades, we're going to go with civil society on this one. we're not going to build a great firewall. And I think now he's a little sorry. He's trying to catch up, and it's hard. That's the kind of thing, technically, it's much better to do it at the beginning than to try to fix it once you've got a lot of different channels of communication technically in the country. On the other hand, Putin did from the outset say that civil society is important, it should be supported, but it should be supervised by the state. And in 2001, he organized a meeting called the Civic Forum. And once again, early Putin years, there was a lot of back and forth. Putin initially had the ministers working for him draw up a list of people to be invited, groups that were acceptable civil society. And the civil society organization said, no, that's not an adequate list. That's not a representative list of the people in this country who are doing important things. And Putin backed down and changed the invite list. He showed up for the meeting, thought he was just going to give a 5-minute welcome speech and go on to do other things. And Lyudmila Alexeyevna, one of the heroes of Helsinki Group and civil society in Russia, in the Soviet Union, stopped him and said, I'd really like you to hear this first speaker. And Putin nodded, sat back down, and stayed for another 15 minutes. So, early on, it was not clear where this was going to go. A couple of years later, it got a lot more clear. 2003, Mikhail Hodorkovsky, who had built Yukos, the most successful private company probably in the history of Russia, had begun to be actively involved in politics. He created his own Open Russia Foundation, sort of trying to pick up the slack because George Soros was cutting back on the Open Society Foundation activity. And Putin got concerned. Oil, which had been at $10 or $12 a barrel when he was prime minister, was 20 to 30 by now. He was getting more confidence. He had been the first person to call and commiserate with President Bush after 9/11, and felt that he hadn't gotten any payback for his support of America. Although I gotta say, my friends in Moscow have their own joke about that phone conversation, that the real reason Bush and Putin were so close was that Putin called Bush 10 minutes before the first plane hit the tower. And something happened in Moldova that really convinced Putin that it was going its own way. The media was probably more important than civil society, but civil society was beginning to be a higher priority for Putin. The second assault came in 2006, after he was elected to his second term. And it was a direct response to the color revolutions, especially in Ukraine, but also in Georgia, Kazakhstan. New law on NGOs was promulgated. There was a lot of debate. I won't bore you with academic arguments. Some of my colleagues said that, well, the foreign funding was a bad thing, but there was a lot of support for domestic organizations. In fact, what we now know, and we've got good data, is that the government-supported organizations in Russia began to crowd out the independent organizations, something that Putin really wanted. This is where he fosters, again, we call them GONGOs, government-organized, non-governmental organizations. That is a contradiction, but it's an important one. Independent groups are pushed to the sidelines, but there's a lot of regional variation. There's some parts of Russia where the story looks a little different. The third assault comes after Putin is reelected, and it's a direct response to the protests in 2011, 2012 over the Russian elections. Russian people were not particularly happy at the idea that Putin was coming back. The Russian constitution differs from ours a little bit. Ours now limits the president to 2 terms. The Russian constitution, again, you think about one word making a big difference in history, it limits the president to 2 consecutive terms. Most people thought that would imply that it really was just 2 terms. But Putin, pulled with Medvedev the move we call the castling. After 2008, he stepped down as president, put Medvedev in, became prime minister, came back as president. I think surprising even Medvedev. Russians weren't happy that Putin was coming back. I think they were resigned. 2/3 of them wanted a major change in their legislature. The Russian Duma was widely unpopular, almost as bad as the US Congress. But here it's slightly different. Here, Congress as a whole gets a bad rating. Everybody likes their own member of Congress in their own district. So it's really hard to change anything. And in Russia, people don't even like their own member from their own district, but they're stuck with them. But 2/3 of Russians wanted that election to change the composition. It didn't. And it set off a major bout of protest in the country. Unexpected, broad, and much more than Moscow, again. It quickly turned personal. And this was the first time, really since 1991, that you had these kind of widespread demonstrations. There had been some, 2005 in particular, against modernization of benefits, but the numbers involved weren't that large, and the problems were addressed pretty quickly. But this is more than 100 cities, every region. People who say that it was just Moscow and St. Petersburg are dead wrong. And I'll quickly give you just a look at around the country. Kaluga is in the Urals, Krasnoyarsk is the Far East, Samara is the Volga region, Vladivostok on the Pacific coast, Kerem in the Urals, Ryazan, central Russia, Chelyabinsk, also in the Urals, a major industrial city, Kazan, capital of Tatarstan. I'm really fond of this one.
And this guy is carrying a sign that says, "Mi za chestny amfori."
Putin, a couple of years before, had wandered into the Black Sea one day and come back with each hand holding a 3,000-year-old vase, which somehow all of the archaeologists and souvenir hunters and grave robbers and everybody else had missed for 3 millennia, but Putin found them. And nobody knew anything this seriously. Putin later admitted it was all put up. But I thought for someone in Tatarstan to be walking around with that was an indication of the sophisticated humor that went into these. Yaroslavl, Voronezh, Ulyanovsk. And even more than the protest, I think what really got to Putin was how personal this became. A friend of mine, St. Petersburg, did this. This is the Putin-Medvedev composite photo put out in 2008. This is the edition of Profil magazine after the WikiLeaks talking about Medvedev playing Robin to Putin's Batman. And so this is Putin in 2024 if he served 2 more terms as president, looking a lot like Brezhnev. St. Petersburg in 2011, Putin in a cage for usurpation of power. Kazan, this is, really, is this a Veliki Khan? Haha, no, it's just a Tarakan, a cockroach. You could understand why somebody as thin-skinned and short as Putin would get pretty upset at this kind of imagery. Kanza is probably not a city any of you have heard of. There are a couple 100,000 people. Putin compared the protesters to banderologi. So this is,
The banderologi Valver.
Again,
Another citation to Kipling, where you're calling a banderolog. And so you've got this King Kong up here. saying who did you say is a motherlode? And this one, come to me, banderolog, and this is Putin holding a condom.
Because he had said that the white ribbons that the protesters were wearing looked like condoms. So he came in for some pretty vicious representation. And I think that is the way we understand the background to what's happened in Ukraine. Putin lost the middle class. He lost Moscow, he lost Petersburg, he lost a lot of the educated people elsewhere. His constituency is now the nationalists and the people who live in smaller towns, smaller cities, rural areas, who don't think as much for themselves and who depend far more on Russian television than the internet. And I think he convinced himself that he could get away with a lot appealing to these folks.
So what's going on in Ukraine is an invasion.
There's no other word for it. It's an invasion by stealth. You send in people who wear unmarked uniforms, you send unmarked tanks, you try to claim that it's the locals doing it. We've got lots of videos where the Russian instigators start something and then get out of the way and let the locals take over. It's not badly done. It's not a show of military prowess by any means. It certainly was planned in advance. Had a friend last summer tell me that his son served in an elite Russian military unit, and in the first half of 2013, people from the military officers were coming around to the unit, interviewing the contract soldiers, the people who were serving for pay, asking them if they'd be willing to go fight in Ukraine, either formally or informally. That is an official operation or something sub rosa. The ones who said yes got their contracts renewed. The ones who said no, I'd rather not, didn't get their contracts renewed. I've got a little bit of other info to support that. I need one or two more sources to really be able to take it public. In Ukraine itself, even the Russian speakers did not want the Russians to come in. In Russia itself, annexing Crimea, regaining that territory, has been enormously popular. But if you ask them if they want to pay for it, or if they want people to die for it, you get a different answer. There's been a very serious problem when the bodies come back. And the regime response has been to silence the voices and narrow the public space, which so far has been fairly successful, but I'm dubious how long that's going to be viable. Okay, so again, they recruited volunteers for the military early in 2013. One story I've gotten directly and indirectly from some of the people in the Ukrainian government is that Yanukovych was told point blank by Putin in the summer or fall of 2013 that if he did not abrogate his negotiation decision to sign a partnership agreement with the European Union, Russia would take Crimea. I haven't gotten any of them willing to put that in writing for me yet, but I've heard it from 3 or 4 different people who were high up in the administration. Yanukovych did change his mind. He had promised to sign the partnership agreement with the European Union. He said no. The Russians rushed in and offered them $15 billion in assistance. Yanukovych, in early 2014, made this public, and it set off another massive round of protests in Kiev. The protesters are not going to go away. Yanukovych met with Putin. Putin said, get rid of them. Yanukovych sent in troops that fired. A lot of people were killed. Yanukovych had to run for his life. And, of course, ran to Russia. Putin initially denied that Russians were doing anything to foster this. He said it was all domestically organized internal activity.
These are the little green men who led the
Independence movement in Crimea. 2 months later, this happened in March, in May, Putin said, of course they were ours. You know, it was obvious.
So, these are the little green men in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. Same uniforms, same face masks, same kit, same weapons.
They're really not Russian. You know, how gullible and stupid are people? And I understand the diplomacy of not calling it invasion, but it really is an invasion. Okay, Ukrainians, even the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, did not want Russians. Back in 1991, 90% of them voted for independence. That number went up and down over time. But in March 2014, right before the annexation of Crimea, 85% of people living in Ukraine were against Russian intervention. Ethnic Russians were against Russian intervention. Over 30% were strongly against it, 23% were in favor strongly. In September 2014, 90% of people in Ukraine were for sovereignty and favored ties with Europe. Even in Crimea, the Russian government claims 97% of Crimeans supported annexation by Russia. Putin's own Presidential Council for Civil Society and Human Rights said that only 22.5% of the eligible voters in Crimea voted. That's hardly overwhelming support for anything. A UN report on the referendum cited misinformation, hate speech, not to mention the killings, torture, and arbitrary arrests. You know, nobody who was there and saw it thought that referendum could in any way be representative. Same thing, the referendum in eastern Ukraine, Donbass, Luhansk, more recently. The effect of Putin's policy, of course, is what you'd expect. It alienates Ukrainians. In July 2012, 17% of Ukrainians polled by a Ukrainian polling organization wanted Ukraine to join NATO, and 70% were against it. 2 years later, after the annexation of Crimea, 44% want to be in NATO, and only 34% are opposed. That is not smart politics. You know, Putin really has lost the affection and the friendship of a country on his border, and fixing that is going to be enormously difficult. Lots of people say Putin, you know, is enormously popular because of his policy in Ukraine. And there too, what you get from polling depends on the question you ask. There is overwhelming Russian approval for Crimea once again being part of Russia. Putin's approval rating is the 85–90% job approval. If you ask Russians would they vote for him again, it was 57% in the summer, it was down to 52% in September. Actually, I don't have it on here, but the latest one is under 50% would vote for him as president another time. Doesn't mean he's not going to come back for another term in 2018, but you know, that job approval versus re-electability are not the same thing. Remember that the first President Bush, who's right where we are, got to 90% approval during the first Gulf War, and he lost the 1992 election. So job approval is not a guarantee of political success. Even fewer Russians want to send troops. Again, 90% support Crimean annexation, but in July of this year, just 11% were in favor of sending troops, 63% said no. When asked if we should send troops if NATO intervened, 13% said yes. In August, 60% of Russians said it's a local conflict. And Levada Center poll just a few weeks ago, 68% would not want their sons to go fight there. You know, that's not support for active military intervention. So again, Annexing the territory may be popular, paying for it isn't. In terms of money, in March, 28% were willing to pay for Crimea. In August, it was down to 17. Now it's probably down around 15. Sending sons is even less popular. And the corpses coming back have been a particularly serious issue. The data on the Russian casualties is being suppressed. Reliable figures has it in the hundreds, possibly as much as 1,000 to 2,000. I've seen estimates as many as 4,000. 39 corpses came back to the town of Pskov, western Russia. They were buried in secret, upset a lot of people. A local deputy who asked for an investigation of why families weren't being given back the bodies of their children was attacked and beaten and landed in the hospital. 20 journalists who inquired after the deputy was beaten were also attacked, individually, different times. In Astrakhan, military officials were absolutely outraged and protested in Moscow when soldiers whose bodies came back were found to have been decommissioned from the military after they were killed. So that Putin could say, no, we don't have troops there, we don't have casualties. And there is a decree, Ukaz number 269, honoring Russians for outstanding service in Crimea and Ukraine. If you go to the Kremlin website in Russian and try to access this, you're told it's not in the public domain. It's a decree honoring the unit that has been fighting there, and obviously they don't want to talk about the specifics of what they've been doing. The word for the bodies coming back is Cargo 200. This was used in the Afghan war. It goes back further in Russian history as well. It's a euphemism for the bodies. One Russian journalist was actually asked to go to Ukraine and accompany the bodies back. Her explanation for why this happened was that they thought that the Ukrainian military might attack the convoy, but if the journalists were there, they might leave them alone. When they gathered to put the bodies in the trucks, journalists from the ORT and Russia 24, the two main Russian TV stations, were there with the cameras and filmed it. It never made it onto Russian television, obvious reasons. But her reporting was that the Russians in Ukraine were army veterans, Cossack, police auxiliaries, Chechen militiamen, paramilitaries from nationalist groups, and like Yedinstvo, a real mix of the Russian nationalist right wing, and they call the Ukrainians fascists. That's the Cargo 200 truck leaving Ukraine at the border. You can see the Cargo 200 barely on that truck side, a nighttime photo. So again, Putin's response is silence the voices. Pskov deputy and the journalists, the Soldiers' Mothers. Soldiers' Mothers is a homegrown non-governmental organization. It goes all the way back to World War I, if not before. Memorial, major historical reconciliation effort. There's a new law on foreign ownership of media, a whole slew of limitations on the press. Given the timing, I think I'll spare you that. I can go back to it. But essentially, lots of restrictions and more restrictions on the non-governmental organizations. Groups that get foreign funding have to be registered as foreign agents. A lot of groups refused, saying that they're not foreign agents. Please prove it. So Putin put through a law that permits the Justice Ministry to register organizations as foreign agents without their permission. My favorite part of this is that Golos, the election monitoring group in Russia, responded by actually taking them to court, and they won a determination from a court in Moscow that they are not a foreign agent. But it turns out that the law on foreign agents has no provision for removing a group or a journal from the list at any time. Once you're declared a foreign agent, it seems you're always a foreign agent. This has caused a renewal of protests. The web sites on here will be available from the Bush Center if anybody wants to follow up on them. There are more, but these are the first 4 I pulled down. This is St. Isaac's Square in St. Petersburg in March of this year. That's Moscow in September. Looks familiar. More Moscow, September. I don't have anything from the regions yet, but I've asked some friends to try to track it down for me. So, basically Putin and his crony group did initiate this invasion of Ukraine, and they are determined to tough it out, but they're going to have a really hard time. The annexation of Crimea, and maybe even the annexation of more Ukrainian territory, in the abstract is wildly popular in Russia. The cost in money and in blood is not popular. And Russian civil society is not moribund despite everything Putin has been doing. So my bottom line is stay tuned. That's Moscow in September. Great Ukraine. I thought that was the closest thing I could find to the Tiananmen 89 guy standing in front of a row of tanks. Woman draped in Ukraine's flag with all those police behind her. Brave and determined. And that's my hope. Thanks. Happy to answer any questions anyone has, or at least try.
Could you see a circumstance later if protests grew, if the casualty rate in the Ukraine increased, and it was indisputable that the Russian troops were dying in larger and larger numbers, that protests could get so bad that Putin would get upset and do what Deng Xiaoping did in Tiananmen Square, that he'd start shooting people to suppress it. Because he didn't do that before when the protests across the country over the election results a few years ago took place. Why didn't he do it before? Why didn't he use force?
He didn't have to. They weren't that threatening. And I think they understood that it could backfire. It's a risky thing to do. Those troops, especially 3 or 4 years ago, were not necessarily reliable. The guys who were sent into Georgia in 2008 had communication equipment that didn't work, so they talked to each other with their cell phones, which made them sitting ducks for Georgian artillery until the planes knocked it out. That would isolate Russia even more than the sanctions are doing now. It would make Russia utterly unattractive to the other former communists, former Soviet Union countries. Kazakhstan and Belarus are already having real regrets and second thoughts, buyer's remorse about their economic agreement with Russia. And they would be very anxious to avoid being caught up in something like that. The world opinion would be against it, and it's not clear if the troops would fire on their own people. The special forces, probably. The military, no. Are there enough special forces? Depends how big the protests are. And that was the problem even in 91. The thing you don't want to have happen, the thing that happened in Russia in February of 1917 and again in August of 1991, is when the troops were told to shoot their own people, they said no. And if that happens to a leader, he's finished, or she. And I think before it got to that, it is equally likely that the elite, who have made a lot of money off of Putin's crony, corrupt regime, would say, wait a minute, this is really getting out of hand. This is bad for our economy. The most likely positive scenario I see is a combination of protest activity and the fissure within the elite, which is already engaged in economic cannibalism. What happened with Yevtushenkov, the guy who owned Bashneft, the Bashkortostan Oil Company, who is now under house arrest, because Igor Sechin, head of Rosneft, needs $44 billion, and taking over Bashneft helps him economically with that. That's a kind of battle. You can understand why Khodorkovsky got taken down, and Berezovsky and Gusinski. Berezovsky and Gusinski had media outlets that competed with Russia, with Putin's message. Khodorkovsky had his own political agenda. Yevtushenkov had nothing of the kind. It was purely economic. That's a whole different world to be in. Because now anybody who has an asset that one of Putin's favorite cronies thinks is essential to his well-being could be a victim. And that breaks up a gang of cronies faster than anything else I can think of, that uncertainty. That sense that if you play by the rules, you're still vulnerable. And that's where he has put himself right now. So, and the sanctions, sanctions don't work overnight. They are biting. I was at one panel in Washington a couple of weeks ago where two of the people who I think know the Russian economy best were having a knockdown, drag-out argument over whether the sanctions would have a real effect in the fall of 2015 or the spring of 2016. That's a 6-month window, to be fighting over as a difference. You've got $400 billion in the sovereign wealth fund, currency reserves. You can get through a year or two, but it's already starting to have an impact. I can name places that know that funds that they were supposed to get are now going to Crimea and they don't like it. Yakutsk is a great example. My wife spends a lot of time there. They built a railroad. Yakutsk for ages has been supplied by bringing in everything they need for the winter during the 2 or 3 months in the summer that the Lena River is navigable. Because if you don't bring it in by ship in those 2 or 3 months, you have to fly it in. Like Alaska, it's outrageously expensive. The railroad changes that. The railroad goes to the other side of the river from the city, and they haven't built the railroad bridge. The funds for that railroad bridge have now been diverted to the bridge over the Kerch Strait to have a link to Crimea. People are not happy. There are only 1 million of them in the Republic, so that may not matter. The North Caucasus has had its development program put on hold. I didn't want to say on ice if I'm talking about Yakutsk. And there's going to be more of that. The pensioners already know their pensions, or the pension fund is being used to bail out companies that are suffering from the sanctions. The effect of that over time, I think, could be fairly significant. So the combination, it's always the mix of the street and the elite. If it's one or the other, it's not likely to produce a good outcome. If you get the two together, you've got a chance. So I am guardedly optimistic. I'm also very concerned that whatever comes after Putin, at least for a while, could be pretty ugly. And Khodorkovsky is now spending the money he has left precisely working on an effort to influence what comes next. He said he wouldn't want to be president of Russia, but he'd be happy to be involved in the interim government to avoid fascism or something really nasty if Putin goes. Maybe more of an answer than you wanted, but that gives other people time to think. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question.
Wait.
Thank you. My question is this. If the invasion is so costly and unpopular, what are Putin's motivations for carrying it on?
I think that initially, he made this threat to Yanukovych. Maybe he thought Yanukovych could come back. I think he misread the situation. He thought it would be appealing to the nationalists. He thought that America had a weak president, Europe was weak and divided, Asia is the future, and that Europe would cave. They didn't. He was trying to play the divisions. And I think he also expected that he could have gotten away with Crimea if he stopped there, is my opinion. That, there's enough economic interest in Europe that they would have swallowed it, even though it's an outrage. When the separatists in eastern Ukraine, Donbass in particular, and Luhansk, and started their activity. The Russian nationalists really wanted to support it. Some of them went in, possibly without Putin's approval. Putin didn't want to risk losing their support. He backed them. I think now he's sorry, but he can't do anything about it. If he backs down, they will be outraged and demanding his head. And if that happens, then we could get a really ugly government in Russia. So, ironically, we're in a situation where Putin may not be the worst alternative, bad as he is, if he can pull back and rein them in. But I think it's out of hand, out of his control. I think he is finally beginning to comprehend just how bad it is. And his leaving Australia early is a real cop-out. Actually, one of Professor Cooper-Smith's colleagues in the history department was showing us some slides of Putin's private plane. The idea that he, in 2 9-hour flights, couldn't get any sleep when he's got gold-plated bathrooms and a shower and something that looks like a 5-star hotel that he flies around in. 18 hours on that plane, anybody could get plenty of sleep. So that was just nonsense. He really had been put down in ways that he is not used to. And how he's going to react to that is going to be very interesting. I hope he gets the plane right to reassess and think of how quickly he could get back in everybody's good graces if he changes his policy. Whether he assesses that domestically he'd get away with it is going to be the hard part.
I thoroughly enjoyed your lecture.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. Is there any potential impact of the downing of the airliner, impact of the Putin's timetable this year as far as Ukraine is impacted and movement into Ukraine? Does that world attention and that event impact his timetable?
Not as much as we would have liked. The Russians just this week put out another photo show proving that a Ukrainian fighter jet shot this plane down. And I've watched it 5 times. I can't see anything there that could possibly be construed as evidence. But the Russians repeat this on their own television over and over and over again. And I've got a paper coming out in Georgetown Journal of International Affairs at the end of the year with some policy recommendations. One of the things we've got to do is get a lot more proactive in the media space. We announced that we're going to renew Russian language broadcasts by RFE-RL half an hour a day. That's tiddlywinks. Putin has got bloggers and email people. I get 15 or 20 email messages every single day from people in Russia defending Russian policy and purporting to show me the errors of Western media. Now, admittedly, they know who I am and I know what I write, so I'm hoping you guys aren't getting this. But it's got to be countered far more aggressively. We're talking about 30 minutes a day of Russian language programming when we really need 30 hours a day. We've got to give them alternative media, especially television opportunities, so people who want other information can get it. The ones who want to go around the restrictions and get it from the internet can do it, but that's 10 or 15% of the population. It's not enough.
First of all, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I actually wanted to ask you first about the really hard informational war that we're having with Russia. I'm from Ukraine, so we usually have a lot of those things that seem outrageous, but for somehow people in Russia believe that. So is there any impact of that propaganda campaign on the public opinion? And is there a way to deal with it, or it's just something, although people have access to the West media and websites, but they still seem to somehow believe in a lot of information.
What part of Ukraine are you from?
I'm from Kiev.
You asked the important question. One of the things that has been a puzzle for me since March is why Russians who were so astute at understanding the way they were being lied to by newspapers and television and radio in the Soviet era are now falling for this stuff. And the best answer I can come up with, and some of my friends who are real experts on media have corroborated it, is so far the message has been something they want to hear. And most Russians are still getting their news from television. And we had a friend from Sakha Republic, Yakutia, at our house over the summer, someone we've known for 30 years, pretty liberal guy, active in civic activities in his home republic. Sakha Republic is home to 90% of Russia's diamonds. It's the size of India and has a population of 1 million. So it's pretty well off economically. And we're sitting at dinner and got around to Ukraine finally after 2 days of talking about everything else. And he immediately said, Banderovцы, which is the World War II pro-German fighter from Ukraine, most famous military guy. And we kind of looked at him and said, yeah, that's 1.5% of the voters in Ukraine. And he stopped and looked at us and said, oh yeah. It was like, okay. Now I've had this with, I was in Russia most of June, talking to friends who are not all that political, same kind of thing. You know, they would talk about the fascists in Ukraine because they're seeing it. You turn on Russian television, and in a 45-minute newscast, 30 minutes to 35 minutes will be about the fascists in Ukraine. It's just a given. One friend of mine who works at the National Security Council on things Russian spent a week in Central Asia and watched Russian television, and said at the end of the week was ready to get a gun and go defend the poor Russian speakers in Ukraine from the fascists in Western Ukraine. You know, because the propaganda was so overwhelming. And that has got to be combated somehow. It's also going to be really difficult when, it explains why Ukraine means so much, not to Russia, but to Putin and his crowd. You know, if Ukraine can become another Poland, if they can join a partnership agreement with the European Union, I'm saying join the EU, I'm certainly not saying join NATO, and if they can develop their economy and become more European and get out of the corruption and the political predation that they have suffered for the last 20 years and make it a going concern, that as a message to the Russians will suggest that Putin and his corrupt crowd are bad news. I think that explains a lot of why Putin is doing what he's doing. If Ukraine becomes a pro-European, even moderate economic success, you know, even Hungary or the Czech Republic, not even Poland, it doesn't threaten Russia much. It's not going to hurt the Russian economy. It probably helps the Russian economy if Ukraine gets richer. But it's a direct threat to Putin. It's an existential threat to the 120 people who have $1 billion because of Putin. And that's what's got to be fought against. And the information war is the best way to do it. Yeah, the more Russians who understand what's really going on and how much they're being lied to, the more likely it is that we're going to get change, possibly for the better.
You alluded to countering misinformation, propaganda information. Just how does a country, a world, how is it done? How do you counter misinformation that Russian people are hearing what they want to hear? Or are they hearing what they want to hear?
Hollywood made a film called Kung Fu Panda that went viral in China. And the Chinese, if you talk to them about it, were astounded that the Americans could do an animated film like this using a penultimately Chinese image and have it appeal to Chinese culture. That's the way you do it. You get the message in a way that is not Western and you know, Putin is all bad and liberal democracy is all good. You get the message across, your sons are being killed and you're not being told about it. This is not being, your pension is being cut, and the reason is to build more palaces for the oligarchs in Crimea. I'm not saying it's easy, but you've got to put those broadcast towers back. You put them in Ukraine, you put them in Estonia, and you send the message and you repeat it over and over again, and you spend some real money on it. And we're not doing that. A half hour a day is not going to fix this. 12 hours a day might begin to. And Russia is a land of rumors. When information begins to spread, it spreads really fast. People do talk, they communicate. There were 100 websites during the 2011-2012 protest movement. That means most of them were not in Moscow or Petersburg, they're all over the country. And people really did plug in. And that's got to be started up again. Hodorkovsky can do some of it. We're trying to get Soros to do more of it. It is an information war, and it is a war of information. It's got to be done. Both for the Russian people and for Europe and America. One more? Okay.
This is slightly off what you're doing, but do you see the Russian invasion from the Ukrainian point of view as posing an existential threat and changing how Ukrainians are thinking about Ukraine and possibly giving them the sort of the equivalent of powder milk biscuits, giving them the strength to do what must be done?
Thanks, very good question. You can see it in the last election. You take, Yanukovych won by 2 million votes. You take Crimea out of the voting, and you take the million Ukrainians who have left eastern Ukraine as refugees. That's Yanukovych's victory margin right there. His party of regions is finished for the near term. And what I think we're really seeing here is a much more united Ukraine than we have seen at any time since maybe the 16th century. Ravi Abdalal, in his excellent book about nations making economic choices based on identity, had Ukraine as the model of the conflicted identity. The eastern Ukraine looked toward Russia, the western Ukraine looked toward Europe, and they couldn't go either way. Now they can. The existential threat, of course, is that the Russians bring in the troops again and try to create a corridor all the way to Crimea, or even all the way to Odessa, because without that, supplying Crimea is going to be nearly impossible. And that's the real danger. The hope, if you want to be an optimist, is that what happened to Putin in Australia and Merkel's speech yesterday are really going to convince him that it would be a serious mistake. The danger is that he's gone so far and has cut so many ties that he feels he's got nothing to lose, and he might as well try to consolidate what he's got. If he does that, it could get really ugly. But even that isn't necessarily an existential threat to Ukraine. Losing the loss-making dinosaur coal and metallurgical complex in eastern Ukraine might be just what Russia needs to be more like Slovakia and Poland. But we'll see.
Thank you very much.